for feedback on sentiments as well as rationale for the measures announced. This meeting is taking place exactly a week after a similar event was conducted in Harare, convened by the Confederation of Zimbabwe Industries National Office. As CZI, we acknowledge the general thrust of the 2025 budget, which is aimed at broadening the tax base, the mandatory registration for corporate and personal income tax in select product and service lines, the automatic VAT registration for tenders reaching a threshold of $25,000 and measures aimed at dealing with smuggling are all critical. However, incentives for informalization remain in place, and it is likely that loopholes will be explored to avoid compliance, as compliance is currently costly. The current tax collection statistics show that once firms have gone informal, it is always difficult to collect from them. Presumptive tax reforms have not been successful, as collections have remained less than 0.2% of the total tax revenues since 2019. Honorable Minister, we are concerned about the shift in the tax base away from the corporate tax and contribution to tax revenue, which shows that the current operating environment is not being very profitable for businesses. Corporate tax contribution in total tax revenue has decreased from about 20% in 2021 to only 9% in 2024. IMMTT has decreased from the close to 10% in 2021 to only 4% in 2024. This is happening at a time when VAT on domestic goods has been constantly increasing, undermining the growing economy. The fact that profitability falling while economic activity is still high is generally a reflection of the high cost of compliance, which is eroding profits, high informality eroding market shares, and displacement of products by imports. This means that the capacity of business positively contribute to tax revenue and help minimize the tax burden on compliant businesses is to reduce the cost of doing business, especially the cost of compliance. New taxes only worsen the burden of existing businesses, and the expected collections might fail to materialize. The recently gazetted finance bill, for example, shows that the fast foods tax, which has announced at 0.5%, has now been increased to 1%. This is now significant and could be inflationary. World Bank data shows that Zimbabwe is the third highest mandatory compliance burden in SADC, as there are about 51 taxing authorities in Zimbabwe at a time when there are only 8 in Mauritius. The data also shows that total tax and compliance rate is 32% of profit for Zimbabwe. This means that collectively regulatory authorities are getting more from businesses compared to investors and treasury. Reducing the compliance costs is one of the most effective ways for raising the tax base and discouraging formalization. Industry is also reeling from exchange rate depreciation, which results in a huge parallel market premium and pricing challenges. The measures which the RBZ has been putting in place are currently facing limitations due to the absence of measures to create demand for the US dollar, which would result in willing sellers of foreign currency. The 2025 budget did not provide for a better performing tax head to be payable in ZiG, as corporate tax has failed to create a willing seller of USD. Honorable Minister, I would not want to belabor issues, as we have representatives from various constituencies with us to shed more on the 2025 national budget. I would like to encourage all participants to be frank and open with the minister so that the Bulawayo community might get the most out of this meeting. I submit. Thank you.
So, Honorable Minister, last year BYD, the Chinese electric vehicle supplier, sold more vehicles than Tesla. I think 10 years before, that should have been unthinkable for that to happen, because China never had an industry to talk about. But how did the Chinese get there? From 2009, they've actually funded the electric vehicle industry to the tune of about $26 billion. Over and above that, the Chinese government, even when the product was still shaky, was the first customer. What are the key lessons that we can learn from China? Number one, the responsibility to create or sustain an industry in an economy lies with government first. Government must be the number one client. Then number two, any budget must have a long-term impact by its nature. It needs to be transformational as opposed to being transactional. Remember, the Chinese decisions made in the 2009 budget had a 14-year effect. What am I getting to? You announced a very welcome development on the suspension of duty on semi-knockdown kits. But you've only given it 2 years, Honorable Minister. If I'm an investor and want to invest materially in a sector, 2 years as a horizon is too short for me to be able to do a feasibility study, mobilize the funding, set up shop and recoup. It's not going to work, Honorable Minister. So my recommendation is we need to have a longer lens when we're looking at some of these initiatives. The government, over the last 24 months, I would estimate that spent about $1 billion in purchasing vehicles directly. But guess what? All of those vehicles are imports. Yet by contrast, when you look at China, it is the Chinese government that is at the front and center of buying local. So again, we need to integrate us seeking to create an industry with semi-knockdown kits. As long as there is no sustained demand from government, we can never commute or grow that industry into a secondary industry. So government must be the first customer. Why are we buying German cars? When you look at the Germans, it's anathema for Germans to drive French vehicles. And when you look at the Russian government, they'll never drive French vehicles. Why are we missing the opportunity to create our own industry and have that 1 billion spent localized and create sustainable demand within our economy? Again, I also looked at the variation of the special economic zone conditions. There's a core accusation that's given to us as a country, and that is policy inconsistency. About 2 weeks ago, I had the privilege to sit with an Indian billionaire. He's got a small investment in this country. Then I asked him the question to say, would you recommend to your friends to come to Zimbabwe? The answer I got was not very encouraging. Then I said, why not? He cited the issue of policy inconsistency. I think if you can take a couple of lessons, investors would rather go to a country where there's war, where there are incursions. I think a case of Mozambique is a case in point. Why would investors rather go to a country with war? Because the policies are consistent, they know what they're working with. They can actually build the risk into their model and put mitigants because they know what they're dealing with. So, Honorable Minister, I don't doubt that the intentions, they were noble, but remember the road to hell at times can be laced with good intentions. We need to exercise policy discipline. I think a missed opportunity is clarity on the multi-currency horizon up to 2030. If you look at the local liquidity environment vis-a-vis the PPP initiatives that need to get done, I think one of the initiatives is probably in the region of $1 billion. Yet when you look at the liquidity that's currently sitting with our pension funds, I think it's close to about 400 million. It's not enough to build a trunk road, assuming that we're to commit all of it. What does that mean? If ever we are to seriously change the countenance of our roads and our infrastructure, we need to be able to tap into liquidity that's coming from outside Zimbabwe. But again, at a 5-year horizon, Honorable Minister, it's not going to cut it. Feasibility study again, it takes about 2 years. Mobilization of funding, that's also a couple of years. Then again, for one to be able to build and also commercialize, convert, recoup your investment, you need as a minimum 7 years. So by extension, 2030 cannot then cut it. I know there was a counter argument to say, but look, we can then allow them to collect their monies in US dollars. But as long as the transacting public, the road users, will be plying that road and liable to road levies, as long as they're earning ZIG, it means that by extension, the investor will not be able to recoup. So I feel that at a time when there's massive liquidity that's sitting with international markets, we are missing an opportunity by not extending that. I think also lines of credit that I, as a banker, which were potentially available, Honourable Minister, we are also missing that opportunity. Honourable Minister, I would also yearn for a time when we would make decisions that are driven by our data, and also to look at climate-proofing our economy. I think we funded agriculture this year, it's 630 million, versus industry, it's only 15 million, that's the allocation. Yet I would have thought that with our aspirations to turn Zimbabwe into a modern economy, we would have wanted to spend more on industry, because again, that's where you get the scale. If you look at some of the quick wins that are currently lying in wait, we do have a potentially big glass industry, which is in Gweru. But that opportunity is not being activated. Why? Because all they need is maybe a $10, $20 million. Either it's by way of a placement, or it can be by way of a thematic fund that the government can establish through industry. We are missing those opportunities. When we look at our tobacco, Honourable Minister, of that 1 billion that we're earning per year, it's only 12% to 20% which is remaining in Zimbabwe. And a lot of that is not being value added. Why? Because there is no funding which is coming to industrialize our country. So it is my aspiration that we climate-proof our economy. Let's try and pivot slightly and strike a balance between agriculture and industry so that we also grow sustainably. Some of the issues that these ones will be quite short. I would recommend, Honourable Minister, IMTT. This one is a killer. There's 2.5 billion, which is in the informal economy. And when you talk to these counterparties, they will cite that it's the IMTT which is the biggest stumbling block. Banks at the moment, some of them are actually not disbursing because they do not have liquidity. Yet we've got money which is lying underneath the mattresses. Yet through a policy, stroke of a pen, we could actually commute that money into the formal sector. Alternatively, let's make it tax deductible for business. When you look at the biscuits and sweets business, I think Blawayo accounts for about 50% of that business. Yet, its sweets and biscuits are on the open general import license. We are not protecting our local industry at a time when industry in Blawayo is very vulnerable. So, Honourable Minister, there's a plea from business that we consider also putting that as part of the restricted areas. The fund for DMAF, this one was quite instrumental in terms of changing the fortunes of a lot of businesses in Blawayo. So there is a cry from business that why don't you consider reviving the fund? If you look at the Africa Continental Free Trade Area, Blawayo is quite strategic because it is a hub into the region. So it only makes sense for us to capacitate them. And then my last point, Honourable Minister, is the aspect of financial devolution. Government has started a very noble initiative of devolving into the regions. But we need to take it a step further by also then considering moving some of the arms from government. If you look at the companies that are relocating to Harare, it's not so much because there's anything special there, but it's because they want to be proximate to the regulator. I can imagine how many planes are coming into Harare purely for the purposes of meeting ZIDA. When is Blawayo going to get the same opportunity? Let's learn from South Africa. You'd find that Parliament is in one area, The executive is in one area. Then when you look at the commercial hub, it's Johannesburg. When you look at the judiciary, it's sitting in Bloemfontein. But by contrast, everything is reposited in one area, which is also not creating economic opportunities within areas like Blair. So I think it's a plea that we'll table formally, Honourable Minister. But many thanks for the privilege. Thank you.